The crisis begins in a place that does not look constitutional. It begins at the fuel gauge. You are not thinking about emergency powers. You are thinking about whether the station has diesel, whether the line will move before dark, and whether the food truck that supplies your neighborhood can make its next trip. Then the line stops moving. A road closes. A delivery is delayed. A hospital worries about supplies. A government says the country has reached the point where police need military assistance to keep routes open. That is the distance this story has to cross, from a missing liter of fuel to a legal document that changes what the state can do. You know the first end of that distance from your own routine. Your car, your bus, your delivery, and your dinner all depend on movement you usually never have to notice. When movement fails, you feel the system before you know its name. Stay with me. By the end of this video, you will be able to follow Bolivia's crisis through 3 separate questions. First, why did fuel become so difficult to move? Second, how did a supply problem become a blockade crisis? Third, what did the state of exception legally authorize, and what did it leave untouched? The answer is not that one announcement caused everything. The answer is a chain with pressure entering at several points: foreign exchange, imported fuel, subsidies, roads, grievances, and the constitutional rules around emergency power. You will see the chain, but you will also see its gaps. Your attention should move from the pump to the dollar, from the dollar to the road, and from the road to the legal document. Each move changes what you are allowed to claim. On the morning of 20 June 2026, Bolivia's Defensoria del Pueblo recorded 42 blockade points across La Paz, Cochabamba, Oruro, and Santa Cruz. That number is a snapshot, not a complete history, but it gives the crisis a shape. This was not one demonstration in front of one government building. It was a road network problem. The same day, President Rodrigo Paz issued Supreme Decree 5636. The decree declared a nationwide state of exception for internal upheaval and set a 90-day duration. Its text placed roads, critical infrastructure, fuel, food, medicines, and essential services inside the field of protection. It also authorized the armed forces to assist the police. The question is not whether the decree existed. It did. The question is how an economy that could no longer move fuel smoothly arrived at a legal instrument designed to make the roads move again. You do not need to memorize the decree number to follow the argument. You need to remember what you saw: a road network under pressure, a state reaching for exceptional powers, and a supply problem that may survive the legal intervention. Before you follow a tanker, follow a mountain. Bolivia was colonized by Spain. In Potosí, the Cerro Rico became one of the great silver centers of the colonial world. UNESCO's record describes an industrial complex whose silver moved through the royal mint and onward to Spain, while indigenous workers were compelled into the Mita labor system. You do not need to turn the 16th century into a cartoon explanation for a 21st century cue. When you picture the silver leaving the mountain, you are looking at the first version of the problem this episode follows. The useful connection is narrower. Wealth entered through extraction, and movement was organized around getting that wealth to external markets. The mountain, the labor system, the mint, and the root were part of one machine. That machine left a political question behind. When the valuable thing beneath the ground is sold elsewhere, who controls the income, who carries the cost of moving it, and who gets to say what the resource is for? Those questions did not disappear when colonial rule ended. They changed their names. As you trace the timeline, you are not being asked to blame one century for another. You are being asked to notice which questions keep returning when the product changes. After independence in 1825, the new republic did not begin with a blank economic map. The mining regions, The routes that connected them to buyers and the institutions that collected value had already been shaped by extraction. You can see the inherited problem in the geography. Wealth is local when it is dug out, but its price is often decided elsewhere. Your map has to include both ends of that route. The record does not support a straight line from a colonial mine to a 2026 fuel queue. It supports a recurring structure. Bolivia repeatedly had to decide whether resource wealth would be controlled privately, negotiated with foreign capital, or gathered through the state and redistributed through public institutions. You can see that argument harden in the 20th century. As you follow the dates, you are watching ownership become a political language. After the Chaco War, Bolivia created YPFB in 1936 and nationalized Standard Oil's operations the following year. In 1952, the National Revolution nationalized the largest tin mines and created COMIBOL. The state was not merely trying to own a company. It was trying to own the route by which underground wealth became national income. The 1952 settlement changed what resource ownership meant in ordinary political life. Universal suffrage, agrarian reform, and mine nationalization arrived together. The state promised that the mine would no longer be only an enclave whose earnings left the country. It would be part of a national project. That promise carried a burden. Once the state claims the resource in the name of the public, people can judge it by the public benefits they were promised. A state company is no longer only a producer. It becomes a wage payer, a source of public revenue, and a symbol of sovereignty. If you are paying for transport, electricity, or food, you meet that promise through a price. If your work depends on a road, you meet it through movement. When the export income is strong, that arrangement can feel like protection. When the income weakens, the same arrangement turns into an argument over who is being asked to absorb the loss. The resource changed again. Oil and gas began to carry more of the national story than tin. YPFB's importance grew, and a natural gas export pipeline to Argentina began operating in 1972. Later, Brazil became another major buyer. Bolivia's energy system was therefore never only a domestic system. Its revenue depended on regional demand, export contracts, pipeline capacity, and the prices negotiated with neighbors. Your fuel tank is therefore connected to a market you cannot see from the station forecourt. You feel that connection when the price changes before the story behind it reaches you. In 2006, Evo Morales' government nationalized the hydrocarbon sector again. The IMF's record of that moment describes a new agreement to raise the price and volume of gas sold to Argentina, while negotiations with Brazil were still underway. The decision was about ownership, but it was also about leverage across borders. You can hold two facts together. Your map of state ownership can be real, and external buyers can still matter because they supplied the market that turned gas into dollars. Resource nationalism gave the state more authority over the income. You still had to sell the gas to someone beyond the border. During the gas boom, export earnings helped the government expand public spending. As you look at that bargain, you can see why it lasted. The state controlled more of the resource, public programs grew, and fuel could remain cheaper at home than the imported product behind it. That bargain was not irrational. Cheap fuel protects transporters, farmers, households, and the movement of food. Public spending can turn underground income into roads, services, and political support. But the bargain also makes the domestic price a promise. Once people build their routines around it, changing the price is not a technical adjustment. It is a renegotiation of the relationship between the state and the public. Now the external side of the bargain has turned. Gas production and export earnings weakened. Argentina's role as a major buyer diminished. Import needs rose while the dollars available to pay for them became scarcer. IMF, World Bank and Harvard Growth Lab analysis describe that reversal in different language, but they point toward the same pressure. A country that once used hydrocarbon income to finance imports now has to defend a low domestic fuel price while buying more of the product from abroad. This is not a story in which colonialism mechanically caused a June blockade. It is a story in which old questions about extraction, ownership, external markets, and public promises remained active, while the commodity underneath them changed. What happens when a promise built during an export boom has to be paid for with imported fuel? The 2026 emergency is where that long argument becomes visible at the pump. When you stand at the queue, the road is the place where a resource export history meets an import bill, a subsidy meets a queue, and a political promise meets the price of keeping it alive. Your ordinary weight is carrying the weight of that older bargain. Start with the part that is easiest to miss when the cameras turn toward a protest. Bolivia's fuel problem was not created on the day the first road closed. It is the latest expression of the longer resource bargain you have just followed. For years, hydrocarbon exports supplied dollars. Those dollars helped the state pay for imports, including fuel. As production and export income weakened, the country needed more imported fuel at the same time that it had fewer foreign currency resources with which to buy it. The International Monetary Fund describes the surrounding pressure in the language of a balance sheet. Persistent fiscal deficits, declining hydrocarbon production, dwindling reserves, high inflation and distortions in the foreign exchange and product markets. That is the slow part of the story. It does not produce a single dramatic image. It produces a country where an everyday subsidy becomes harder to finance, and where the price on the pump no longer resembles the cost of getting the fuel there. Your first instinct may be to look for the one price announcement that started the crisis. Keep that instinct in view, but do not let it erase the background. Your visible price is a political promise. Your invisible import bill is an economic constraint. Picture this from your own household budget. The price printed at the station is the number you can see. Behind it are the dollars used to buy the imported product, the taxes and transport costs, and the public money that absorbs the difference. When one of those hidden numbers moves, your visible price may stay fixed for a while. That does not mean the pressure disappeared. It means someone else is carrying it. For a government, carrying that difference can preserve social stability. It can also postpone the moment when the supply system has to admit what the imported litre costs. The longer the gap lasts, the more political weight is packed into the price promise. Imagine a warehouse receipt. The receipt says a shipment exists, but the receipt is not the shipment. It can be delayed, pledged, discounted, or trapped behind a missing payment. Fuel subsidies work in a similar way. A low domestic price can make fuel affordable for drivers, farmers, and transporters. But the difference between that domestic price and the cost of importing the product has to be carried somewhere. By the budget, by the state oil company, by foreign exchange reserves, or by the supply system itself. The receipt is the price promise. The tanker is the physical product. The road is the point where the promise meets reality. Once the dollars become scarce, each part of that chain becomes visible. When you see a line at a station, you are seeing a queue. When you see the state budget, you are seeing a subsidy. When you see a foreign exchange shortage, you are seeing the ability to pay. Your story changes depending on which of those three windows you use. Imagine you are holding the receipt and watching the tanker leave. You cannot tell from the paper alone whether the shipment will arrive on time. You need to know whether the payment cleared, whether the route is open, whether the station's allocation was cut, and whether the product is being sold to the customer the subsidy was meant to reach. That is why a shortage can feel mysterious. Your local queue is the last link, but the failure may have entered much earlier. A line of cars is a physical trace of decisions made in a currency market, a public budget, and a distribution network. Bolivia's state oil company, YPFB, says the balance changed sharply. Its 2026 explanation puts domestic gasoline production at 40% of consumption, with 60% imported. In 2014, YPFB says the domestic share was 80%. That is an official operating account, not a neutral national time series. It is useful because it explains the company's own position, and it must be read alongside the IMF and independent economic analysis. The broader pattern is consistent across those records: falling export revenue, rising dependence on imported fuel, and a subsidy whose fiscal cost grew as the supply base became more exposed to dollars. The important phrase is not "Bolivia ran out of fuel." The documented record is more precise. It shows a country struggling to keep the imported supply chain fully fed, while the political system still expected the domestic price to remain low. You do not have to accept every number in an official explanation to see the mechanism it is trying to describe. The YPFB figure tells you how the operator frames dependence. The IMF figures tell you how a multilateral institution frames reserves and subsidy cost. The independent analyses test the larger direction of travel. Together, they give you a structure without pretending that one table answers every question. Careful readers differ over how much weight to place on each explanation, especially when a state company describes its own constraints. That disagreement is useful. It keeps the story from turning an operating account into a universal verdict. Put yourself beside a fuel terminal before sunrise. The truck is there. The station is expecting it. The customers are already waiting, but several questions sit between the tanker and the pump. Has the shipment been paid for? Is the allocation full? Can the station receive the product? Is diesel being diverted toward a more profitable market? Does the state have enough foreign currency to keep the next shipment moving? When those questions accumulate, the shortage is experienced locally even if fuel still exists somewhere in the system. A road blockade then changes the scale of the problem. The price of a liter is one question. The ability to move that liter and the food, medicine, or person attached to it is another. The Defensoria's report on the period from 1 May to 15 June identified effects across free movement, health and medicines, humanitarian conditions, essential supplies, education, justice, and journalism. Those categories matter because they show what the road does. A road is not only asphalt. It is a delivery system for every institution that cannot produce everything where it is used. If you have ever watched a delayed delivery turn into an empty shelf, you already understand the scale change. Your individual inconvenience becomes someone else's inventory problem. Their inventory problem becomes a transport problem. Your transport problem can become a political demand. The protests were not a single-issue machine. Fuel prices and shortages were central. So were anger over subsidy changes, the cost of living, transport conditions, and the wider direction of the new government. Different groups could occupy the same road for different reasons. The government's explanation emphasized public order, access to essential supplies, and the need to stop blockades from isolating communities. Protesters and sector organizations described the cost of fuel and the economic burden of the reforms from the other end of the chain. These accounts do not have to be collapsed into one sentence. The road can be blocked because people oppose a policy, and the blockage can still create real supply risks for people who did not choose the confrontation. If you were standing on that road, the same event would look different depending on where you stood. A transporter sees a fuel bill and a route that no longer pays. A farmer sees the cost of moving harvest. A resident sees a queue and a price that may enter the cost of food. A hospital sees delivery uncertainty. A government sees a route that can isolate a city and a legal duty to protect access. Those are not interchangeable perspectives. They are different positions inside the same network. The public argument became intense because the network forced each group to experience someone else's decision. That is the first discipline of the story. Do not mistake a common location for a common motive. You can keep both sides of the road in view. Your sympathy need not substitute for evidence, and your skepticism need not erase the people waiting for fuel. The record becomes clearer when you ask what each group was trying to change. What did the driver need? What did the transporter need? What did the government believe it had to prevent? As you move through the story, keep your own position in the frame. You are not outside the system. You are one of the people who depends on it. Now return to 20 June. Decree 5636 declared a state of exception for internal upheaval across the country. It gave the executive extraordinary tools within a legal framework. The armed forces could support the police. Routes and critical infrastructure could be protected. The decree addressed fuel, food, medicines, and other essential supplies because the emergency was defined through the country's ability to keep moving. The power was broad enough to matter. The limits were important enough to matter just as much. Bolivia's constitution allows a state of exception in cases including internal upheaval, but it says that core rights remain protected. It preserves due process, the right to information, and the rights of people deprived of liberty. It requires the Assembly's approval within 72 hours, and it requires the executive to account for the reasons and the powers used. An emergency declaration is therefore not a blank check in the constitutional text. It is an exceptional route with a clock, a legislature, and rights that the declaration cannot simply erase. Your next question should be practical. What changed on the road and what changed only on paper? If the answer is different for you as a driver, for a hospital, and for a police commander, that difference is part of the legal effect. Did the emergency change movement, supply, prices, or the authority to intervene? Which of those changes can you actually measure? For you as a viewer, the legal distinction is easy to lose because the words state of exception sound like a suspension of ordinary life. The constitutional text is narrower. It creates an extraordinary power for a defined danger while preserving a floor of rights and accountability. That leaves a question the decree itself cannot answer. Were the measures necessary and proportionate to the disruption on the roads? The answer requires looking at what happened next, not only at the language used to justify the declaration. The next day, 21 June, the Plurinational Legislative Assembly approved Decree 5636. The decree's published record carries the Assembly Resolution reference, and the approval was reported by ABI and contemporaneous Bolivian press. That step changes the legal story. The declaration was not only an executive announcement, it passed through the constitutional approval mechanism within the required window. The Defensoría del Pueblo then stated the conditions it believed had to govern the emergency: legality, proportionality, temporariness, human rights protection, and constitutional and legislative control. In ordinary language, the document had to do two things at once. It had to give the state room to reopen routes, and it had to remain answerable to the rules that made the room lawful. The government's stated problem was not abstract. A blockade on a road used by fuel trucks can interrupt the next station, the next town, and the next hospital before the first shortage is visible on a national chart. The decree's protection of routes and essential goods translated the economic problem into a policing problem. It treated movement as the immediate point of failure. But a route can be reopened without the underlying supply equation being repaired. That distinction is where many crisis stories become too simple. Clearing a road is an event. Restoring a dependable fuel system is a process. The two can happen at different speeds, and one can occur without the other. Reports in the following days described blockades being cleared in much of the country, with continuing conflict in parts of Cochabamba. The Defensoria reported a reduction in conflict points and opened a post-conflict agenda around health, supplies, services, and economic reactivation. That is evidence of a change in the road situation. It is not proof that the fuel crisis had ended. If you measure success only by whether a barrier has been removed, the operation looks complete. If you measure it by whether the next delivery arrives, whether a bus can leave, or whether a clinic can plan for supplies, the test is longer. A cleared route is the beginning of the measurement, not the end. This is also why the emergency's 90-day duration matters. A temporary legal power can outlast the moment that made it politically attractive. Its use has to be judged against the conditions as they change. When does a temporary power stop being temporary in practice? What evidence would show that the conditions had changed? If you measure success only by whether a barrier has been removed, the operation looks complete. If you measure it by whether the next delivery arrives, whether a bus can leave, or whether a clinic can plan for supplies, the test is longer. A cleared route is the beginning of the measurement, not the end. This is also why the emergency's 90-day duration matters. A temporary legal power can outlast the moment that made it politically attractive. Its use has to be judged against the conditions as they change. On 26 June, 6 days after the declaration, the Defensoria carried out a national verification at 20 stations in all 9 departmental capitals plus El Alto. The report gives us the middle of the story, where an emergency is tested against ordinary queues. All 20 stations were selling gasoline when inspectors arrived. Diesel was available at 70% of the stations. 30% were not selling it at that moment. Gasoline queues ranged from 30 to 580 vehicles. At some stations, people reported waiting more than 48 hours. Diesel queues ranged from 46 to 128 vehicles. The report recorded waits of 12 to 24 hours at several stations, more than 48 hours at others, and more than 72 hours at one. This is why the pump matters. A national decree can change the legal power of the state in one day. The queue tells you whether the physical system has caught up. The same verification found reduced allotments at 35% of the inspected stations. At affected locations, reported reductions ranged from 17 to 67% for gasoline and 20 to 50% for diesel. The report does not prove that every queue had one cause. It does show that the emergency's immediate context remained materially constrained after the roads began to reopen. Look at what that evidence can and cannot tell you. It can tell you that inspectors found a physical shortage pattern across a national sample. It can tell you how long people reported waiting and where diesel was unavailable. It cannot, by itself, assign every missing liter to subsidy policy, blockade action, foreign exchange scarcity, or diversion. That boundary protects the story from a false precision. You can see the pressure without inventing a complete causal ledger for every station. What would a complete ledger require? Which institution recorded every shipment, every diversion, and every delay? You can mark that boundary in your notes. What you know, what you are told, and what remains unmeasured. Look at what that evidence can and cannot tell you. It can tell you that inspectors found a physical shortage pattern across a national sample. It can tell you how long people reported waiting and where diesel was unavailable. It cannot, by itself, assign every missing liter to subsidy policy, blockade action, foreign exchange scarcity, or diversion. That boundary protects the story from a false precision. You can see the pressure without inventing a complete causal ledger for every station. There are at least 3 possible results to measure. Did conflict points fall? Did trucks and people regain access to routes? Did fuel distribution become reliable enough that the queues shortened and the allotments recovered? The available record answers the first question more clearly than the third. The Defensoria reported a reduction in conflict points between 20 and 22 June. Reports described routes being cleared. But the 26 June verification still found long queues, missing diesel at some stations and reduced allocations. That is not a contradiction. It is a sequence. If you remember only one analytical move, remember this one. Your first question is whether the road opened. Your second question is whether fuel moved through it. Your third question is whether the price and supply system became more stable after the movement returned. The state may have improved movement on selected roads, while the imported fuel and foreign exchange pressure remained inside the system. A road can be open and a supply chain can still be fragile. For your mental map, hold those 2 facts apart. One is a security outcome. Movement improved at selected points. The other is an economic outcome. Fuel distribution remained stressed. If you merge them, you will call the emergency either a total failure or a complete solution. The record supports neither shortcut. What would you expect to see if the underlying system had genuinely recovered? Shorter queues, normal allotments, fewer reports of missing diesel, and less dependence on emergency intervention. Those are observable tests, even when the political language around them is not. Would your answer change if the road reopened but the queue doubled? Would the legal result be the same as the economic result? The decree also moved into the courts. By 4 July, local legal reporting described at least 6 constitutional challenges. 4 were reported rejected for admissibility defects. The final disposition of every challenge is not treated here as settled. That caution is part of the legal story. A challenge can ask whether an emergency was justified, whether its measures were proportionate, or whether the procedure followed the Constitution. Those are different questions from whether a road was blocked or whether a station had diesel. One record describes conditions on the ground. Another tests the authority used to respond. Neither replaces the other. You can hold those records beside each other. Your map of the blockade tells you where people were affected. Your map of the Constitution tells you what the state could lawfully do. Neither map tells you everything about the other. The same separation applies to the people who challenged the decree. A legal challenge does not prove that every blockade was lawful. A blockade does not prove that every emergency measure was lawful. Each record answers a different question, and your confidence should stay attached to the question the record can actually answer. The story did not end when the June roads reopened. On 17 August, Decree 5676 introduced a different kind of pressure. The measure created a reference diesel price for direct and large volume consumers. YPFB said ordinary users filling vehicles at stations remained at BS 9.80 per liter, while the new reference price applied to specified higher volume categories. The regulator's resolution for 90/2026 separately records a $1.76 reference price for imported diesel sold to legal entities and private parties. The distinction matters. This was not a universal pump price change for every driver. It was an attempt to separate ordinary retail supply from higher volume and direct consumption, while reducing the gap between subsidized domestic fuel and imported cost. If you hear diesel rose to 18 Bolivianos, ask whose diesel and where it was bought. Your ordinary station purchase may remain at one price while your farm, fleet, or factory faces another. Your household can be protected from an immediate shock while your food or freight costs change later. That design may reduce diversion and fiscal pressure. It may also move the price shock into the sectors that consume diesel at scale: agriculture, mining, logistics, and industry. A measure can protect one price while making another part of the economy more expensive. The August policy is therefore a coda, not a clean resolution. It shows the government still working on the same underlying problem through a different channel. For you, the useful comparison is not price up or price unchanged. Ask, for whom, for which volume, and at which point in the supply chain? A household filling a car, a truck operator, a farm buying bulk diesel, and an industrial user may encounter different rules even when they buy the same product. That segmentation is politically important. It can narrow the immediate shock for ordinary motorists while concentrating the adjustment on producers and distributors. Whether it improves supply depends on what those users do next, and whether private imports and the regulated network can meet the demand. Now assemble the chain. The colonial resource economy established the oldest pattern. Value was extracted through a territory and moved toward external markets. The 20th century state answered by taking greater control of mines and hydrocarbons, turning resource ownership into a promise of public benefit. Regional gas buyers and the commodity boom made that promise easier to fund. Declining hydrocarbon income then reduced one source of dollars. Scarcer foreign exchange made imported fuel harder to finance. The low price promise became more expensive to maintain as import dependence rose. Fuel pressure became a political grievance, alongside broader demands from transporters, campesino and indigenous groups, businesses, and urban residents. Blockades turned that grievance into a road network crisis, affecting the movement of fuel, food, medicines, and people. The executive answered with a nationwide state of exception, and the assembly approved it within the constitutional window. The roads then became more open while the cues showed that the supply system was still under strain. You can watch that sequence without choosing a slogan. Your timeline has two tracks: movement and supply. One track can improve while the other remains damaged. The gap between them is where the real test of the emergency begins. The chain is real, but it is not a single cause verdict. The evidence supports the links as separate, bounded claims. It does not support the claim that one reform explains every grievance, or that the emergency by itself repaired the fuel system. You can now see where the argument is strong and where it thins out. The legal declaration is a primary record. The 42 blockade points and the 20 station verification are attributed observations. The fuel dependence figures are an operator's account placed beside multilateral and independent analysis. The casualty numbers are not collapsed into one total. The final court status is not turned into a dramatic ending without a verified disposition. That is not a lack of story. It is the story's shape. A crisis becomes legible when you know which parts are measured, which parts are reported, and which parts remain open. You began with a gauge. You followed your gauge to the cue, your cue to the road, your road to the decree, and your decree back to the supply system. The point is not to make you carry every number. It is to leave you with a map of what each number can mean. Return to the driver at the fuel gauge. At the beginning, the gauge seemed too small to explain a constitutional crisis. Now the gauge is the visible end of a much longer chain. It points backward through the foreign currency needed for an imported litre, and further back through the gas and mineral exports that once supplied that currency. It points sideways to the road that moves the litre. It points forward to the political argument over who pays when a subsidy no longer matches the cost of supply. And when the road stops, the state has to choose whether it is facing a price dispute, a public order emergency, a supply failure, or all three at once. Bolivia's state of exception was the legal answer to a road crisis in June. The cues recorded days later show, why the legal answer was not the same thing as an economic solution. The road can reopen before the system is repaired, and a fuel crisis can become a crisis of state power without ever beginning in a courtroom. The Ledger of Empire playlist continues with another standalone story about how a resource bottleneck can narrow a government's room to maneuver.